Okay, quick one here today. It's a book review or maybe a book recommendation. This is Lukan, Authorship of Hebrews by David Allen. I just happened to read this past week and I thought it was pretty fascinating. And this is more than a book just about the authorship of Hebrews. Even if you're not interested in trying to figure out who wrote Hebrews, it's a good commentary on not just Hebrews, but Luke and the book of Acts. And obviously, from the title of the book, you know where the author lands on his opinion about who wrote it. But I just want to point out some of the highlights that are just beyond authorship. But he makes the point that Luke is the gospel that depicts Jesus as the high priest. He does that more so than any other gospel. At the start of Luke, Luke 1, you have him in the temple with Zechariah and Elizabeth. And the book ends with Jesus blessing the disciples at his ascension, just like an Aaronic blessing there. And the prayers in Luke are more prominent than the other gospels as well. And then you've got the 10 lepers, and Jesus tells them to go to the temple. There's some deeper things in that story that kind of point to Jesus maybe being a high priestly role there. This was kind of new to me, but when I looked online, it looks like it's pretty obvious to some people. But the Theophilus that Luke wrote to in Luke and the book of Acts, there was a Theophilus who was a high priest in the year 37 to 41. And the author here, David Allen, he actually believes that Hebrews was written not only that the Luke and Acts were written to Theophilus, but also that to stick with that priestly tradition, he believes that Hebrews was written to priests in Antioch of Syria who had scattered from Jerusalem and gone to Antioch in Syria. I personally thought that the fact that maybe the priest is too exclusive of a group. I think there's probably more people that are involved in the audience, but I did think that was he brings up some good points there. This story of in chapter 13, how it says those from Italy greet you. A lot of people and scholars seem to think that Hebrews may have been written to Christians in Rome. I think it's the opposite, and he makes a good argument there, his analysis, that it's written from Rome. It's not written to Rome. And I think most might agree that an audience closer to the temple would make more sense. I mean, yes, if we're supposed to, get away from the temple, stop performing these sacrifices because they're useless, that would make more sense if someone is closer to the temple. I do see that some people say, oh, well, it's just telling Christians in Rome not to go back to the, Judaism in general, but I think it's more literal. Let's, get away from this temple here. There's also discussions in this book about Qumran, Dead Sea Scrolls, Melchizedek. What I found really fascinating, he has a heading here in one of the chapters about Hebrews and the Petrine letters. So you've got Peter's letters. There are many similarities between First Peter and Hebrews that have long been recognized by scholars. That's a quote from the book there. That is actually what got me back into looking at authorship of Hebrews. I know I go down this rabbit trail every once in a while. I'm sure we all do once in a while. I want to figure out who wrote it. And most recently, I was leaning towards this idea that Silas wrote Hebrews, and I couldn't find a book on that, but I kept seeing this book about Lukan authorship, and I just felt like I should read it. And sure enough, this has been kind of like a jackpot. There's so much good information here. And a very interesting thing here, I'm highlighting this. This is something I'm looking into, but in this book, Luke Authorship of Hebrews, the author points out that it has been suggested by some that Luke and Silas are the same person. If that's true, that's just fascinating, and that would help answer a lot of questions. There's plenty of people who get name changes in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. I mean, you can make the argument that, yeah, they do get name changes, but it's pretty obvious. It's not like it just happens out of nowhere without explanation. But again, when you look at this Luke and Silas thing, and I haven't dug into it too deeply, but this would be fascinating. They're never mentioned together. When you start looking at the we passages in the book of Acts, you can make an argument that Silas is being talked about there at some point. But again, there are many similarities between First Peter and Hebrews that you just can't ignore. At least the author of Hebrews must at least have a copy of First Peter in front of him as he's writing this letter. So again, good book. Even if you're determining the author of Hebrews, that's not your primary goal. It's still a good, fun book to look at. But if you are interested in authorship of Hebrews, I would have to put this in a required reading because there's so much good information there. The question comes up, is it the same author? After reading this book, I'm completely convinced that it's the same author for all three books here. This doesn't necessarily solve the question completely because you still have the question of how much influence did Paul have on Luke or Silas or whoever wrote this. So that, again, lots of unanswered questions, but if you're just looking for a good resource into something that interests you, I recommend you check it out. But if you also have any other good book recommendations on authorship of Hebrews, I'm always looking into that. So just share that in the comments section. And as always, until next time, contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints, and God bless.